I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Chris Germer, all the way from Cambridge in Massachusetts. Very welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Liz. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you, first of all, just for agreeing to come on the podcast, Chris. You are very busy. You travel the world. You are well known and respected as an author, a teacher, and a trainer. And, you know, when I sent an email in with my request, expecting it to be rejected, you immediately responded saying, yeah, sure, you know, when's good? When will we get the time? And I love that. And I'm really grateful for that, Chris, that you are accessible, you know, not just to the Oprah Winfreys of the world, but to the Liz Gleesons also. So I really appreciate that. We have a lot of listeners who I have no doubt are going to really benefit from your wisdom today. Chris, you are a clinical psychologist and a part-time lecturer at Harvard. And with Dr. Kristen Neff, you've co-developed the Mindful Self-Compassion program, which I attended the bare bones of that in Cork 2 weeks ago, which you taught with Carolyn Gramp. And like I said, you teach workshops, trainings globally and also online. A little bit about your background. So Chris, would you start maybe with telling our listeners what you mean by mindful self-compassion?
Yes, well, I'm really glad to be on this call with you, particularly to talk about grief, which I think underlies a lot of our lives when we're in distress. So I'm looking forward to how this unfolds. When it comes to self-compassion, there are many ways to look at it. Very simply, it means to be as kind and understanding to ourselves when we suffer as we would toward a good friend. And that's actually not all that common, you know. When things go wrong in our lives, we kick in what we call an unholy trinity of reactions. We criticize ourselves, we isolate ourselves, we ruminate. But self-compassion is quite the opposite. Kristen Neff operationally defined self-compassion in 2003. And rather than criticizing ourselves, self-compassion as the component of self-kindness, rather than isolating ourselves, self-compassion as the component of common humanity. In other words, a sense, even in the midst of our distress, that I'm not alone. And self-compassion also has the quality or the component of mindfulness, which is kind of the opposite of rumination. It's a kind of spacious awareness rather than being entangled and over-identified with our problems. So those three components, self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness, are really the essential parts of what self-compassion is. And when you feel all those at one moment, that's a moment of self-compassion.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I think what I love about this work, your work and Kristen's work, and Paul Gilbert as well in the UK, is the science that's there behind it, Chris. This is so grounded in science and on the physiology of, you know, what is going on in our bodies when we're going through a difficult time. So maybe without getting too technical, would you describe in simple terms what's happening in our nervous system, perhaps when we are in deep grief? And like you said, I don't know the words you used, but Julia Samuel, who was my guest last week, called it the shitty committee, you know, in the brain, these thoughts and ruminations that just, there's no spaciousness in them. Everything is wrong. I'm wrong. Everyone around me is wrong. What I'm going through is wrong. You know, when that's taking over, could you describe what's happening in our body and then how self-compassion or learning that can change that? And that's a big question that could have a week-long answer, but do your best with it.
What's happening in the body in a moment of grief, you're asking?
Or a moment, yeah, exactly. When, not necessarily a moment of grief, but the grief experience, you know, when the rumination is there, when we are stuck in the opposite of mindfulness, stuck in rumination, very vulnerable, very angry, aggressive, feeling threatened.
Yeah. So I think it's important to say that grief itself is not a problem. You know, just like any human emotion is not a problem. It's, you know, it's information, and it's part of the human experience. You know, we have emotions that we like, you know, joy and peace, and we have emotions we don't like grief or anger. But the problem with grief is that we fight it, we resist it, we wish it weren't so. And when we do that, we put ourselves in a state of stress. And the state of stress is a threat state. It's when we have cortisol and adrenaline running through our bodies. And what mindfulness and self-compassion does is it changes our relationship to grief. It actually allows us to be with it as we would with a friend, you know, turning toward it in a friendly way, in a kind way, in a curious way, in a accepting way. And that actually changes the experience of grief. Often when we're talking about grief, we're actually talking about our resistance to grief, you know?
So true.
So self-compassion and mindfulness are a way of being with difficult experience. Mindfulness is a way of holding the grief itself, and self-compassion is a way of holding ourselves in a moment of grief. And both of those components, holding the experience and holding the experiencer, allow us to be with grief in a new way. It actually allows grief to move in our body. It allows us to feel it in our body and move in our body and not be overwhelmed. You know? So the reason why we fight it is because it's overwhelming. When we fight it, we get in a threat state, in a stress state. And when we can activate the resources of mindfulness and compassion, something quite different occurs in the body. The body actually moves from a state of sympathetic arousal and stress to a state of parasympathetic activation or relaxation. And other parts of the nervous system and the brain also get activated, because compassion is not only about relaxation, but there's also the aspect of connection or affiliation. And connection and positive affiliation associated with pleasure, and even pleasure centers in the brain get activated when we are in a state of compassion. So there are very different physiologies. There are also different brain patterns. So what really matters is how we relate to grief, whether we are able to turn toward it with an attitude of curiosity or friendliness, or whether we, with every fiber in our body, wish it weren't so. And so our physiology follows our response to grief.
So what I'm curious about, Chris, is, you know, I've studied this and experienced it and practiced it to a degree. It's not always accessible to me, but I have the information there and the wisdom and the lived experience. So I really get what you're talking about. And I find that some people I meet don't have access to it, or are having difficulty accessing a state of mindfulness and a state of self-compassion. It's like you described, you know, we have our safe circle when we're well. It's like Pat Ogden's window of tolerance. You know, we're well, we feel good inside the safe circle. Or sometimes our circle can be challenged. So, you know, we are okay, but we're feeling challenged, we're a bit dysregulated. Or beyond that, we're feeling totally overwhelmed. And sometimes I meet people who spend most of their time in that overwhelm. And it could be because, for example, a recent bereavement, but it's triggered old attachment wounds. So I meet people very often, and I've experienced this myself as well, where you feel you are so alone in the world, you're so vulnerable, and nobody gets you. Nobody can say the right thing. Now, the actual reality of what's going on doesn't matter, but this is really what your experience. Nobody understands me. Nobody wants to understand me. Nobody listens to me. Nobody is safe. The world isn't safe. How do we begin to bridge that circle of total overwhelm, somebody living there or existing in that reality, which feels very, very real when we're in it? How do we bridge them back, bridge ourselves back to the safe space again, if we've never known it or only known it at certain times of our lives?
Yeah. So you're raising a really important issue, Liz, and that is that grief sometimes is larger than the event that triggered the grief. That in fact it triggers old wounds, and in fact often old traumas. And when old traumas get triggered, we become overwhelmed. And so then the question is, how do we move ourselves back into a safety zone? And yeah, so and in particular, what is the role of self-compassion in that? So the essential self-compassion question is, what do I need? So when we're in a state of overwhelm, if we have the capacity to ask ourselves, what do I need? That itself is a self-compassionate act. But often in a state of overwhelm, we can't answer the question because we actually can't think in a state of overwhelm. So then it helps to be more specific. And that is to say, what do I need to feel safe? What do I need to feel safe? And all of us actually have skills that allow us to feel safe. And that is, how do we care for ourselves in simple behavioral ways? Like, do I, take a warm bath? Do I drink a cup of tea? Do I pet the dog? So self-compassion, to move out of a state of overwhelm, often begins with a question, what do I need to feel safe? As well as, how do I care for myself already? And to practice self-compassion behaviorally. In other words, to do familiar, comforting things. That itself is a radical act when we're caught in difficult emotions, because usually, first of all, we can't think very clearly. We don't know what to do. And often we just get caught in that unholy trinity I was talking about before, that we lose our, what we call executive function, or ability to self-regulate our emotions. So the first step in terms of self-compassion is behavioral self-compassion. What do I need to feel safe? Or how do I care for myself already? And to do it. I should add that when a tragic event happens in our life and we feel grief, and then old traumas come up, it is an invitation after we feel safe to address those old traumas. And they can be addressed in a variety of ways, one of which is, counseling, or, in other words, getting somebody else to help shoulder the enormity of the trauma and to begin to reprocess it. But when we're working with trauma, the foundation of trauma is a sense of safety. The second phase is then reprocessing, and the third phase is integrating into one's life. But it's really a very important point you're bringing up, Liz, which is sometimes grief is a lot more than grief, and it's helpful to be able to say that this is old trauma, so that we can actually see what we're dealing with and then be able to, in fact, work to alleviate.
Yeah. I love that, Chris. And I love that you've talked about the behavioral aspect of self-compassion, because again, we can have read all the books in the world, attended all the great trainings and workshops, met the great teachers, but until we actually start to embody what we're learning by taking action, you would have taught us this in Cork, you know, self-compassion isn't just a feeling or an attitude, but there's also a yang part as well as that yin part. There's the yang part which calls for action. Um, and certainly, you know, you mentioned taking a bath or talking to someone. Literally change, that's how change happens. It's in millions of little moments all joined together. So, you know, it literally is, what do I need right now? How can I address my needs right now in this moment? And then doing the same thing in the next moment, and then the moment after that. And I think that's so hard for many of us with attachment wounds, because we're sitting waiting for that person who's going to come and pick us up and do it for us. Do you, you know, I know it's not specifically grief, Chris, but like you've said, often grief will bring up very old wounds. You know, it's not just a current grief, but lots of things will come up with grief, and the volume will turn up on them. Um, what might a self-compassion practice look like practically? You know, the yang part of it, the action part of it. What might somebody start doing if they are stuck in that overwhelm? What might someone start doing to feel safe on a regular basis?
Yeah, so just let me explain perhaps to the listeners yin and yang self-compassion, which is
Thank you,
the
yes.
particular interest right now of my colleague Kristen Neff. She's actually writing a book on the subject, and I think it's enormously important, so I appreciate you bring it up, Liz. So the yin side of self-compassion is the quality of being with ourselves in a compassionate way when things go wrong. The yang side of things is taking action in a compassionate way. So many people think of compassion as primarily a soft thing about nurturing, but is it any less compassionate for a firefighter to run into a building and save somebody, you know? So compassion really, really does have an action component, and it has a being with component. In other words, there's a being and a doing part. And the two of them really need to be balanced, you know. So sometimes, you know, you were talking about early attachment wounds and in the context of grief. Sometimes we just really need to be able to say in a yin way that this is really painful, this hurts, you know, and I'm not alone, just to kind of, as it were, validate how we feel. So the yin side of self-compassion has the qualities of physically soothing, emotionally comforting, and also validating, being with. The yang side has the qualities of protecting from harm, like, you know, if we're being harmed or if we're harming ourselves, to be able to say, no, stop. It also has the quality of providing, which is to actually know what we need and give ourselves what we need, which is often not apparent when a person is stuck in grief. And motivating. You know, the hardest thing for people who are grief-stricken is to do things, to get up and do things. And sometimes we have to, you know, in order to take good care of ourselves, we have to do difficult things. So those qualities of protecting, providing, and motivating are what we call yang self-compassion. And so if we're just going to take one of those elements, let's take motivating. You know, we know that something is really good to do. If I'm in a state of grief, I still need to, for example, feed myself. But I don't have the energy to get up, to get out of the house. I don't even want to bathe. I just don't want to go there. So how do we do this? And in other words, how do we do this action yang component of self-compassion to actually, you know, get out of the house? And there are two ways of motivating ourselves. One is to motivate ourselves with criticism, like, what's the matter with you? You're just sitting around the house, you don't smell good, and, you're letting your life slip away, and this is, you're finished, which is really negative, really critical, and not very motivating. That's not self-compassionate. Or do we motivate ourselves with kindness and encouragement, which is, honey, you've just gone through a really difficult period of your life, and your heart is struggling, and you really don't want to get out of the house, but you need to feed yourself, and you really do feel better when you feed yourself, and you also feel better when you bathe and you get dressed. And so why don't we just take it, as you were saying, Liz, one step at a time? Let's just do one little thing, one small thing together on your behalf. In other words, we can kind of talk to ourselves as if we are our own best friend, and just move the dial 1 millimeter toward that thing which we know is good for us with kindness. And this is young self-compassion. This is really good for us. But what's the critical difference between motivating ourselves with compassion and motivating ourselves with criticism is the tone, is the attitude. So what we're really doing is creating a friendly attitude to ourselves in the midst of struggling or suffering. And that is sometimes not so easy to come by, but we can learn it. As you said, Liz, one little act at a time, one small act of kindness will gladden our heart and lead to another one. We don't have to look at we don't have to look 2 years down the road at, we just look at what's directly in front of our nose and be kind to ourselves.
I love, Chris, that Kristen is writing about this, and I really look forward to reading that, because I think this, the whole idea of self-compassion being action-oriented as well as an attitude is absolutely vital to it making a difference in people's lives. Because I think, we can have all the information in our head. We can know that self-compassion can help us. We can read the books, do the meditations, but the yang, I think, is what will help us break through the resistance, because even a small act of positive change for ourselves can be tear-inducing for many of us. Even something that we know is going to make us feel good, such as going out for a run, or even just a walk, or even getting dressed for some people, the idea of that can bring us to our knees. But it is so important that we don't wait till we feel like doing that. It's like a CBT, right? Don't wait until you feel like doing something. Do it because you know it's going to make you feel better, because you're feeling bad.
Yeah, you're so right. You're so right. Yeah. And that's what a good friend does. A good friend says, come with me. Let's go do blah, blah, blah. In other words, together we can, and we can be that kind of good friend to ourselves. We can accompany ourselves down a difficult path to recovery.
Yeah. And this leads me on to something else, Chris. Often there was so much, like even in the media today and on social media, there's a movement around grief, and a lot of the focus can be on how other people are getting our grief wrong, how other people are saying the wrong things to us. I'm guilty of that at times as well. People sending the wrong kind of Christmas cards, or writing insensitive things in a Christmas card, for example. But it boils down to, what am I doing for myself? I can sit around waiting for everybody else to say the right thing, do the right thing, bring me my dinner, understand how I feel. But ultimately, until I can do that for myself, probably nothing's going to shift for me. I don't know who said that lovely phrase, "You are the one you've been waiting for." I know it's in Frozen 2, because I went to see that yesterday in the cinema, and Elsa, gets to the island and discovers she's the one she's been waiting for all along. But it was said a lot, a lot before that by somebody else. You are the one you've been waiting for. What are you going to do to help yourself in this moment. Would you speak to that a little bit, Chris? The importance of that.
Yeah. So to start by connecting what you were saying about, sometimes we're in a state of grief and we really need a kind of exquisite, authentic validation, or someone who can actually really understand how we feel, and we crave that and we hope to get that from somebody else. And other people often fail rather miserably because everybody's living their own lives and kind of doesn't get it. So I think actually it's our existential condition as human beings that other people will not understand us as much as we would like, and other people will not love us as much as we need. And, therefore, what do we do? But the amazing thing about self-compassion is that actually we have the capacity to provide the kind of validation that other people cannot do in Christmas cards and condolence cards. We have the capacity to see clearly in a loving way what we need, and we have the capacity to give it to ourselves. And this doesn't mean 100%, because we're all humans, which means we're social animals, which mean we do need each other, but we actually don't need each other for as much as we think. When we're children, we cannot survive without somebody providing everything. But as adults, we can provide for ourselves, but most importantly, we can be a good friend to ourselves. We actually can supply the love and understanding, a large amount of the love and understanding that we are desperately hoping to receive from others, particularly in a moment of grief. We can provide that for ourselves. Sometimes we need somebody else to help us to see that and help us to give that to ourselves. But to assume that the hands that are reaching out sometimes for years for love and acceptance and understanding from another person, to assume that those hands will be forever reaching out and yearning and unsatisfied or angry that it doesn't come to ourselves, is actually kind of denying an extraordinary resource that we have within ourselves, which is the capacity for self-kindness. Those hands can actually be turned toward ourselves, could be put over our own hearts. We can actually give ourselves that which we so desperately need and crave from others. Not 100%, but it's amazing. Maybe 75 or 80%. And the interesting thing is that once we start giving these things to ourselves, we become actually much easier to be with. And then it's easier for people to make us smile. And then, frankly, they're going to come around and be more curious and want to get to know us better and probably meet our needs better. So anyhow, the bottom line is that not only does self-compassion supply a lot of the unmet needs that we have vis-a-vis others, but it also can get us in what's called a upward spiral, where when we feel a little better, then it's easier for others to be with us, and also our expectations are more easily met by others, and relationships are more mutually rewarding. So the main thing is just to recognize we do, each and every one of us, have this resource. And as long as our eyes are pointed outside all the time and trying to get something from somebody else, we won't see it, and we won't have the capacity to actually meet those needs.
Yeah, I love that, Chris. You've put that so beautifully. And whilst we can go into a downward spiral, emotionally, we can also go into an upward spiral. And it's a good thing to ask ourselves, anytime we're having a thought or saying something, what way am I spiraling? Is this helping me to go upwards, or to go downwards, and where do I want to be orientating towards. It's lovely. And it's really reassuring. We are interdependent beings. We need each other. We need each other's support and validation. And we can give a lot of that to ourselves also. And it should be an imperative. I mean, the Dalai Lama, was it the Dalai Lama or Buddha, said, if your compassion does not include yourself, it is incomplete.
Yeah.
So we need to definitely ask ourselves, when we have those hands outwards looking for other people to meet our needs, what of these needs can I meet in myself? And I think it was Julia Samuel that said in the last episode, Julia is a grief therapist from the UK. She described someone whose mother died when they were very young as having a mother-shaped hole.
Mm-hmm.
What are the holes that we're trying to fill? And how can we address that ourselves rather than constantly looking for someone else to fill them?
I like your use of the word "and." We need others, and we have this resource which is usually completely overlooked within us, and we can actually supply a lot of these needs ourselves. This is a revelation to most people. And the reason why self-compassion is so popular, in my view, throughout the world, is because it's almost like, discovering, gold in a familiar place. Like, I had no idea this was here. So, just to sort of to be directed toward this inner resource can often make a big difference. What we do is we call it a U-turn. In other words, our affection, our eyes, our compassion is usually directed outward. So what would it be like to just offer some of that compassion that so readily flows toward others back to ourselves? And when we do that, there's often an aha experience, like, I had no idea. For some people, it's almost like infatuation. My own mother at 83 years old, after learning about self-compassion, said, I didn't know I could love myself. I didn't know it.
Yeah.
83-year-old woman, because nobody told her. She's a really good person, an incredibly compassionate human being throughout her whole life, but nobody told her she could love herself. So this, I believe, is why self-compassion is so popular now, because people are basically discovering a resource that was always there.
Yeah. And I think, Chris, like every poet and philosopher that's ever existed and written about the human condition, so much of the searching and seeking we spend our lives doing, we come back to ourselves. Is it Wordsworth who wrote that lovely poem about traveling around the whole world and then finding himself, back at home, essentially with himself in his heart? And I think the lovely Leonard Cohen sung about that and wrote about that also. One of my favorite new words when I'm talking about grief is paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And I got so excited down at Cork at your 2-day training, because as I was listening to you speaking, the whole time I was taking notes and relating it to grief and where that could be relevant to grief and to grief models and theories. And one of the paradoxes of self-compassion is, when we suffer, we give ourselves compassion, not to feel better, but because we feel bad. But then we can also feel better. But if we do it to feel better, it doesn't work. Would you talk a little bit about that, Chris? Because this is really important, isn't it? This is resistance versus acceptance in a sentence.
Yeah. So that's what we call the central paradox. So if people pick up self-compassion, they say, oh, I feel so terrible, so now I'm going to throw some self-compassion at it and that'll make me feel better. We actually find that it, usually doesn't work, because we're trying to manipulate our moment-to-moment experience, So that phrase, that saying that you mentioned, can be understood in the following way, and that is, if you imagine that you have a child who has the flu, and the child's 10 years old, and everybody in school has the flu, and it's a 4-day flu, and your child has it day 1, you're getting ready for basically 4 days of a sick child at home, and your child is crying and saying, "Oh, mommy, oh, daddy, I feel so bad." How do we treat the child, Well, we feel sad for the child. We know what it's like to be sick, and we do whatever we can to make the child comfortable. But we're not taking care of the child in order to, trick the system so that the child's flu is only 1 day and not 4 days. We know it's a 4-day flu. So there's a spontaneous kind of natural outpouring of the heart toward a child on the first day of the flu, just for its own sake. Just for its own sake. And that's what, when you were saying, when we suffer, we practice not to feel better, but because we feel bad. Simply, we're caring for the child simply because the child feels bad. So what do we do in a moment of grief? Often when we feel grief, the first response is, I don't want to feel this. But if we follow that central paradox that you mentioned, from a self-compassionate point of view, there's a different initial reaction. There's a kind of a turning toward with tenderness, like, oh, this is grief. And I just like to follow the 3 components of self-compassion for a moment: mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness. So when we have a moment of grief, to turn toward it and to be able to say, oh, this hurts. This is a really difficult period of my time. I am in pain. And I feel it in my heart. I feel it in my stomach. I'm unable to, think like I used to. I'm unable to do the things that I've been doing. This hurts. So that's mindfulness. That's being with our experience just as it is. The second part is common humanity, which is this is how it feels to be grieving. This is how people behave when they're grieving. Grieving is a part of living. Everybody in this world at some point grieves. This is what grieving is. Now I know it is so hard, but I'm not alone. Even in this moment, surely there are other people who are suffering in the way that I am. And in fact, many people are probably on this call right now because they can do this. They can say, I'm grieving, and they're looking for common humanity. They would like to hear the conversation. So part 1 is to feel the size of the cloth and the difficulty. Part 2 is to understand that's the human experience. And part 3 is self-kindness. Self-kindness means, as I mentioned earlier, to ask yourself, what do you need? And to talk to yourself as you would a good friend, to support yourself as a good friend, to motivate yourself as you would a good friend. That's self-kindness. So these 3 components, mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness, are not an adversarial relationship to pain, or in this particular case, to grief. We're actually opening to it in a tender way. We're opening to it as we might open to a beloved child that is suffering. We're opening to ourselves in a tender way. We're recognizing the suffering, we're feeling connected to the suffering, and we're kind to ourselves, as we would be toward a child with the flu. The alternative is to fight it. The alternative is like, I shouldn't be feeling like this. I'm going to throw mindfulness at this. I'm going to throw compassion at this. And there's a saying, what we resist persists. And in fact, then we're just kind of using self-compassion as a rarefied or shiny new form of resistance. It doesn't work. Alternatively, what we can feel, we can heal. But we don't want to just feel it. We also want to be kind to ourselves. Mindfulness is the feeling. Compassion is the kind to ourselves. It's a new relationship to emotional pain.
It's lovely, Chris. Thank you. I was actually, just before I go on to that, the more I accept myself as I am, the more I change. That was the little quote you gave from Carl Rogers, I think, while we were down in Cork. And what it's essentially saying yeah, is just acceptance of our condition in the present moment is the only thing that can really help us to change. But if we start accepting in a desperate bid to change, somehow it doesn't work. What I was going to, sorry, you've got something to say, go on.
Yeah. So there are really two kinds of acceptance. There's acceptance of our moment-to-moment experience, which is, and then there's acceptance of ourselves. And Carl Rogers' quote, which is, "The curious paradox is the more I accept myself just as I am, the more I can change." That's more acceptance of oneself rather than experience. But both kinds of acceptance are really important, and they're also interrelated, because who we are is ultimately the sum total of our experiences and how we relate to those experiences. So I just want to say that what Carl Rogers was talking about was, in my view, even more radical than accepting our moment-to-moment experience. It's about actually embracing our imperfect humanity, our fundamental fallibility, our incompleteness, embracing the inevitability of suffering in life. This is really a radical thing. And so in self-compassion, with self-compassion, the idea of self-acceptance is we're not saying that we can let ourselves be exactly like we are for the rest of our lives. What we know that we'd like to improve in various ways, but what we are saying is that the foundation of this thing, in other words, to just kind of look at ourselves and to say, I am a human being. I feel like this. In a moment of grief, this is part of being human, to radically accept our experience and ourselves just like this creates infinite possibilities on what to do next. And actually, what we do next that will uplift our lives comes very naturally and easy. We don't have to work at it. Pulling ourselves, in other words, out of grief is harder when we don't do this first part, which is to let ourselves be a grieving human being with a lot of tenderness, right? It's very hard to let ourselves be a grieving human being without a lot of tenderness. So all we're saying is self-acceptance, true self-acceptance. The foundation of it is this warmth and kindness toward ourselves in our imperfection. And then as a result of that, change happens, and happens so much easier. So we have to take a few steps back. We have to go home. We have to hold our tender, wounded heart in a new way and see what happens, and it will become much easier.
Yeah, gorgeous. Chris, I want to let you know about something that happened here last week. I live in Greystones. It is south, about 40 minutes south of Dublin on the east coast. It's a lovely little town by the sea. And I was asked a few days before it to facilitate a remembrance service down on the beach, which one of our local town councillors decided to literally put together a week before it was to be held. And it was just to, I suppose, acknowledge that common humanity, that, grief is, we need to welcome it into the community and hold it as a community, and that grief can be felt as a community. Particularly in my town, there's been a few suicides recently of young people in the community, so it's very much felt at a community level. That I was down there on the beach, it was at 7 o'clock last Thursday. It was lashing rain. It was cold. It was dark. And I felt I was really, say that word, channeling you and Kristen, the wisdom that I've got from you both. I've looked at many of her videos online. But standing there with a group of 50 people, all deeply grieving, in a circle on this little beach in the rain, and we acknowledged, this idea of the mindfulness part of self-compassion. The only way through grief is to grieve, is to be with the emotion, to be with the wailing, the snot, the tears, the anger, whatever it comes. It has to be felt in order to come through it, and to make it a little bit more bearable to carry. And the other beautiful piece was I invited the group to stand with their hand, behind the heart of the person to their right. So there's all these people who've probably, many have never practiced mindfulness before, or maybe understood the word compassion in any sense. All these people from the community would be very private grievers, a lot of them standing with their hand on someone's back. And it was actually precious. And I share this with you because I want you to know, and I want Kristen to know, where your work is reaching. Your work.
It's so beautiful to hear. And, what you're describing reminds me that yet another paradox is the best way to learn self-compassion is in community. So if compassion is a kind of tender way of holding ourselves, interestingly, because it's kind of hard sometimes to hold ourselves when we're suffering, it's good to be in community, in a loving community, and then kind of slip ourselves into that community, as you did on the beach in the lashing rain, to slip ourselves into that community, and naturally then we start to feel warmer to ourselves as well. Anyhow, what I'm especially appreciating about what you were sharing, first of all, the story was just really touching, but the lashing rain on the one hand, and then how people were relating to themselves on that beach in the lashing rain. It became actually a beautiful thing that was ultimately beyond the rain, So in my view, it's a really vivid, poetic metaphor for what it's like in a moment of grief. In a moment of grief, we are in the midst of a very lashing cold rain.
Yeah.
And in this case on the beach, you had other people who were connecting and providing the warmth, the emotional warmth that made it precious and meaningful. But also when we don't have that, a circle of people around us, we can still provide the love and the warmth to ourselves that actually renders the stormy weather manageable,
Yeah, absolutely.
And the best way to learn that is in community.
Yeah, we said that on the night. We stood there, and my opening words were, "Okay, it's lashing rain. This is not what we ordered, but it's what we got." And it's a little bit like grief. Nobody orders childhood leukemia, but for some people, it's what they get. So we're standing there in the lashing rain. The papers I was holding were damp and falling apart. I couldn't read my notes anymore. There was a bereaved father who was trying to play a song and it just wouldn't play. And I was like, yeah, this is life. This is life. And in the middle of it, there was people holding umbrellas over each other. There was a guy from the Coast Guard holding a little child who was standing to his right. There were strangers hugging each other who don't know each other's names. And it was just a little moment in time. But what I did say to everyone there is, when you're feeling lonely, when it happens, when you're feeling vulnerable, when you're feeling like nobody's there and this is only your experience, I want you to really take, in your mind's eye, a really good snapshot of this group of people. And you pull that in, of all these strangers who understand grief, and pull it in and use it when you need it. Because you aren't alone, no matter how lonely you feel.
If you were in the United States, you would be known as a medicine woman.
Ah.
You would be in community delivering the medicine for suffering, which is kindness and compassion. and helping people to find that in their hearts. You are a medicine woman on that beach.
I'll take that. I'll take that. That's beautiful. Chris, thank you so much for your time. And I know people will listen and re-listen and listen again. And I sincerely hope to anyone listening that this will make a difference, that this will change the trajectory of your grief.
Thank you so much, Liz. It was really a rich time together. And I agree. I hope it provides some comfort, solace, and resources to the listener.
Yeah. And Chris, I know your website has a lot of free resources. There's meditations there, information on your trainings, your book, which I have as well. So I will link all of that in the podcast description. So if anybody wants to get more information, more of Chris's wisdom, there's lots on the website, lots on YouTube, lots of free resources. Take the gifts, people. Take them and integrate them and pass them on. Chris, thanks a million.
Thanks, Liz.